So thank you. I'm Matt Spangler, a faculty member from Animal Science, and certainly a pleasure to be able to moderate this panel today of stakeholders. As Jennifer said, we did prepare 3 questions that we provided to them ahead of time. Some got them more ahead of time than others, but nonetheless, they received them. And so I'm at least going to ask one of them to kick off. Each panelist will have the opportunity to respond to that question. And after I introduce the first question, and before they respond to it, if you would, panelists, just give a brief introduction of yourself to the group. So to just kick off, I'd ask the panelists, for the industry that you represent or are most familiar with, what do you consider the principal points of trepidation relative to data sharing, and how might those be overcome? So Bob, I'd go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, pick the guy you know the best, right? Thanks, Matt. And thank you to the organizing committee for the opportunity to be here. My name's Bob Weber, and I'm a professor and department head at Kansas State University and oversee off-campus research and extension centers in the eastern half of the state. And so I've got all the mission areas of our discipline focus at K-State, so agronomy, horticulture, livestock production, youth development, family consumer science, I got it all. But come from a background in beef cattle extension, primarily background in cow-calf production and seed stock production and genetic improvement, and so trainings in animal breeding and genetics, and that's where Matt and I have known each other for a long time and worked together closely. As one of my service roles through the university, I've been a longtime participant as Central Region Secretary and currently Executive Director for the Beef Improvement Federation. So think of BIF as an industry trade group of collaborating beef cattle improvement organizations. So those are typically state-based associations, as well as our national breed associations here in the United States and Canada. So we work closely with a set of partners in Canada and their provincial and national breed associations up there. One of the roles of BIF is the standardization of data collection strategies for beef cattle, with the focus of using that information in genetic improvement strategies. So we've seen an evolution over time in that space from land grant service providers that used to run genetic evaluations. So the prominent locations were my colleague and friend J.R. Tate was at Iowa State, so they were one of the principal organizations. Cornell University, Colorado State, University of Nebraska, and University of Georgia. Those service offerings have transitioned now to primarily industry partners, so either breed associations building a co-op, which we'll talk about as one of my examples in a bit, that provide genetic evaluation services, research support from land grants and other entities, but the breed associations have taken on a very prominent role in that. A few industry partners, so Neogen's a genotyping company, provides a genetic evaluation service as well to several breeds here in the U.S. So that's kind of my background and perspective that I bring is largely a genetic improvement one, but with a sort of a forward view of where we might source additional information for both genetic improvement, as well as a host of sort of production management data and documentation of practice with a vision towards attributes for products. So I was really interested in the market makers approach because we are talking very actively in the beef segment about sustainability and how do we document our product from conception to consumption across the whole value chain with lots of partners. How do we send that information along as an attribute of the product to the consumer? And so this data integration is very central to a lot of the discussions that are going on in the beef space. So to answer Matt's first question here, one of I think the biggest stumbling blocks historically in the beef space is because of our segmented ownership structure. So you can think about the beef value chain, seed stock producers, commercial cow-calf producers, stockers, feedlots, packing segments, kind of wholesale and distributors, consumers, okay? there's a change of ownership pretty much at every one of those segments. And because of that, there's a competitive relationship that exists and a market competition at each one of those transactions. And so willingness to share information that we might gain at the packing segment back through the chain sometimes is very difficult, because that provides competitive advantage to those entities that they're not particularly willing to give up. So trust is a big issue in our business, and trust in data exchange is a huge challenge. And so where we have examples of people working together, they've figured out, primarily at the back end of the chain, so seed stock and cow-calf production, how do we work in a data co-op sort of model, so our breed associations provide that function where I contribute value and information into the system, but I get something back from that in the way of genetic predictions and other support services for my business model. But it's all based on this idea of trust. And so there's concern, even as a researcher, when we go out and talk to folks about access to industry-based data, concern that somebody else is going to get a market advantage or a market benefit that doesn't come directly back to the provider or owner of the data. And so I think that's, the biggest elephant in the room in our space. There's a number of other challenges related to, rural internet, IoT kinds of issues, data collection, data expertise in, most of our 800,000 U.S. beef producers qualify as, they either have an off-farm job. Not many of them have, a degree in computer science or data literate in that way. So, C++ and Python are foreign words to them, right? And so having, ways that we can conveniently integrate data and capture data is another big stumbling blocks, and one that, kind of keeps extension guys like Matt and I up a little bit at night to think about those kinds of solutions.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Royce Shaneman, Executive Director of the Nebraska Wheat Board. And I guess first off, it's interesting to hear, since I deal with wheat and have for a number of years, in a way I kind of lose sight of what some of the other industries are doing or what's been going on. And a lot of the things that you mentioned about the beef industry, a lot of that same platform information is the same things we're looking at in wheat. It's just a crop versus livestock, but all the same things that you mentioned really apply to what I was going to say as well. So working with the Wheat Board, I also work with an entity called Plains Grains Incorporated, and they're an entity where we do quality testing of the crop as it's harvested. We mainly focus on hard red winter wheat in this group, because that's mainly what's grown here in Nebraska, through the plains and a little bit into Montana and the PNW. And, as we collect all this information, maybe in a way we make it harder on ourselves. Being a food grain, there's probably about 30 different tests per sample that we can run to evaluate the quality of that crop, how it's going to mill, how it's going to bake. Depending on the end use, there's a number of different tests that we can do. And we've been doing this testing for a number of years and have a lot of data, a lot of information. And we've been using that to help market the crop. This data is all collected. All of our domestic mills can access that information, as well as our international customers. So if they're looking for a particular end-use characteristic, we have dashboards where they can go in and select 30 different, put in their parameters for the type of wheat they're looking for, 30 different parameters, and it'll search by a grain shed region and say, here's where you can find that wheat in the U.S. So we're, as we use that for marketing, we've also collectively looked at all the other pieces of information that are out there and starting to build off of that. So we're kind of starting on the ends and building towards the middle. However, as we go through this, to get to an answer to the question is, just using this for marketing so far, what we've seen are producers are worried about the security of that data. You know, from what information we do put out there, we've already noticed our competition are the ones that visit the site probably more than our customers. So there is some trepidation there. There's also a concern on, as more and more information gets built into this system, what's going to happen with the wheat trade? How is the trade going to react? Are they going to be positive towards more information maybe being out there to the customer? We are working with the trade on issues like this. Obviously, cost is always at the forefront. What's it going to cost to build? What's it going to cost me as a producer? And then also associated with that cost is who's going to have access, and could this information be used against me? Especially on the wheat side of things, different elevator systems have different specifications when you deliver wheat. Some don't test at all. Some have a battery of tests they put on the wheat before you can even dump it. So, and those are associated with premiums and discounts depending on the year, depending on, you know, what's going on in the marketplace. So, of course, everybody looks forward to the premiums, but we also know that there's discounts associated. So there's always trepidation about that. So those are probably the biggest things, and I'll stop there and let Genevieve talk.
Hello, my name is Genevieve Tonages. I'm the interim director for the Nebraska Grain Sorghum Board. I could reiterate a lot of what these gentlemen said regarding their respective industries. I think a lot of this is going to be similar for all three of us. But I will just boil it down to three main points of trepidation that I'm seeing, what I'm hearing from producers. I'm not a producer myself, but what I'm hearing. Number one, who owns the data? That seems to be a big point of contention. Is it the producer? Is it the crop consulting company? Is it a larger overarching company? What does that look like? Number two, who's making a profit on this? Obviously, I think most of our farmers are going to understand that somebody has to be making money on this just to operate, right? But I think ultimately what they're wondering is this data going to be accessible only behind a paywall? Because I think that does, for a lot of them, change things and how they feel about the data sharing. Third is security, and I think we've all mentioned security concerns, and there's been a lot of talk about that already today. Are there boundaries in terms of where the data collection starts, where it stops, who the data can be shared with, what rights the producers have over their own data, and kind of like Royce said, how can the data that's collected be used in a variety of ways? So that's really what I'm seeing from producers I've spoken to, and there's a lot of data collection going on in the sorghum industry. We're doing a lot of research. Sorghum is being used for all manner of things, being both a food grain and used for livestock, ethanol in some places, a variety of things. So that's really what I'm seeing.
So we do have more prepared questions for the panel, but I do want to make sure that the audience can ask questions of the panel as well. So if you do have some, just stick your hand up in the air, and if I'm not paying attention to you, throw something at me, and we'll make sure we get your question addressed. So not not by design. We heard a lot of commonalities, I think, in the concerns. One thing that stuck out to me was this notion of competition amongst all three, and the idea as well that I may now be penalized for the value or the lack of value my product has downstream, right? That some people may be rewarded, some people may be penalized, and that can create some concerns. And I heard that come out as well. If we go to in your respective industries, what you think may be the most valuable initial use cases for data sharing. I'm wondering what you think those might be.
Mistake number one, don't pick the mic up first, right? Thanks, Matt, and I think this is an insightful question as well, and one that, from the beef space, I think there's kind of two, at least as, and I'm, again, I look through the world as an animal breeder and geneticist, so there's always this sort of back end idea of how do we use the data for livestock improvement, and so how do we aggregate data and move it along the chain to get back to a breeding decision maker in a way that's useful to them. And so to support that idea, one of the challenges we have in our business right now is we have good aggregation at the seed stock level of breeders actively engaged in data submission at one degree or level or another in terms of completeness of that data into a set of centralized breed association databases, several cases of those where they aggregate data together across organizations for a centralized genetic evaluation. That stuff's all pretty well sorted out, okay, which is a pretty remarkable feat by itself. The challenge we have is how do we move data collection to the next layer of producers? So utilizing the commercial sector as a data source for genetic improvement in a range of traits that the seed stock producers themselves may not be very suited for data collection of those endpoints. So some examples of those phenotypes might be carcass merit, so end product attributes that we capture at the harvest segment. We got to get it 2 spots or 3 spots back up the chain to make breeding decisions. That's a big challenge. There's integrated systems that do that are sort of informationally integrated, but they're private, not sort of public-based or publicly accessible systems. Cow longevity, maternal traits of cows, where it takes lots and lots of phenotypic records and a long time to collect. Seed stock producers, because of the generation interval and rapid turnover of genetics, don't collect particularly good data in that space, where a commercial sector would be a much better spot to collect that. So we have some needs that span segments that some kind of think blockchain-ish sort of movement of data back up the value chain would be particularly helpful. Other spaces include particularly genomics data. So, how do we move around, large amounts of sequence or genotype information to the various industry segments that might make use of that? So that may be, to a researcher to do, basic and applied research work into the genetic evaluation system. There's lots of potential users of that information, even downstream. So how do we validate claims against genetic improvement for greenhouse gas emission? You think of all kinds of stuff that might have a genetic basis that we want to document the genetic improvement of a specific animal or product clear to the consumer. We don't have a good way to move that information along either. So a data backbone has been proposed for a long time in our system, driven on a national mandatory animal ID system, which has had lots of resistance from the consuming public, i.e. the producers. And there's some voluntary systems coming about to help support that from an animal disease traceability perspective. And so real limited scope, but using that as a backbone for another system that provides data transmission might be a really helpful architecture.
Okay. In the wheat world, I guess I'm going to kind of go back into this testing, and I suppose we're in Nebraska. I can brag about the University of Nebraska, right? Okay. One thing that a lot of people maybe don't think about, and we can use all these elements to tie in. I've got to give our university credit. We've got a lot of different programs and research things going on that once you add all these things together, it's a lot of powerful information that can be utilized. So we've got a TAPS program where producers enroll in it, and it's kind of a blind test on what your inputs are, what your yield is, what your quality is once they evaluate the crop. And you can blindly compare with your cohorts and see Are you a high-cost producer, low-cost producer, where you fall? And for the cost of all those inputs, is it worth it to chase that yield, to chase those quality parameters, things like that? That's expanding, and a lot of good information there. We also, in the wheat world, we've got a national yield contest, and a lot of people right away just say, well, all you're doing is chasing yield. Well, there's also a lot of other critical pieces of information in there. We can look at varieties, we can look at climate differences, growing practice differences, and that funnels back to our breeding programs. Wheat is a little bit different than other commodities where we don't have the private industry investment into genetics like corn or soybeans, so we rely pretty heavy on our land-grant universities to do a lot of that work. So all this information that's driven from all over feeds into that. In Nebraska, I've got to give our university credit that with discussions with us, we've revamped our variety testing program, and actually the speed that data's turned around. We're also revamping our variety release committee, and all of that information builds. And as you look out into the industry on a national level, we're doing a life cycle study where we take into account all the different growing methods and practices used all across the country, how that affects the industry. That builds even more on, carbon footprint, carbon sequestration, all those kinds of things. So anyway, long story short, I'm getting around to we've got lots of different pieces of information, all the way from the breeding program through our international customers and what all their end uses are, all the products they make for the market they're in. And what we're starting to do is pull all this information together, start to build a system. And in fact, if you get the chance, I ran across this website not too long ago. It's fascinating to me. Look at Vessel Finder. A map pops up. It's got all these little dots all over the map. You can track any vessel at any time. When you click on it, a picture of the vessel pops up, tells you who owns it, where it's at in the world. You can look at it on a map. So basically, if we know all this information, our wheat breeder here at the university is making breeding decisions on that. Those variety releases are all being tracked. We do variety surveys, so we know how much of each variety is grown in a certain region in the state. Well, we have all the quality data on those varieties, on how they should perform. Our biggest wild card in this is Mother Nature. So then from there, we know what the basis prices are. We know what the market prices are. We know what our customers want. Once it's on a vessel, we can track it. There is so much information out there that in the wheat world, we're trying to pull all that together, find the places where there is value. Again, another shout out to the university. Corey Walters has been doing a research project looking at the value of each one of these quality tests in wheat. So then you start to build the value. I think we're a long way away in a commodity market of having that a producer being able to demand the price they deserve. But we're inching that way. We're getting closer. If you can meet a certain quality characteristic that adds a lot of value, it becomes a little more of a direct marketing. And then one other one I've got to give a shout out to before I'm done is USDA, NASS, has tons of great information on there. They're making adjustments all the time to making that information more usable, more user-friendly, and being able to generate graphs and charts and show trends. There's amazing stuff out there, and at least in the wheat world, we're just trying to piece all that together, find the value, be able to utilize it to the producer's advantage.
Yeah, and I could reiterate a lot of what Roy said. A lot of that applies to the sorghum industry as well. I really like what you said, that at a certain point, Mother Nature becomes the wild card. The best thing about this overall is that it lends some semblance of predictability to what is largely an entirely unpredictable industry. We also have a lot going on with the university. We do all manner of research. Sorghum, again, there's food grade sorghum for ethanol, sorghum for forage, livestock, etc. So that on top of bioplastics, there's a gentleman in Texas right now who's using sorghum stalks and the waste produced from sorghum to create a sort of insulation for homes and buildings. That's so much information, right? There's so many variable factors in terms of what types of sorghum they're using. There are all different manner of millets too that would be considered in the same family. So data sharing does allow all of these people in the sorghum industry to share that information, talk about inputs, what's working for them, what isn't. And at the end of the day, that is great because this is a large industry that encompasses a lot of things. I think for the producers, though, what is better? There's a saying in agriculture, I'm sure a lot of you have heard it. The most expensive thing a farmer can do is exactly what his grandpa did. And I think there's a lot of truth in this because a lot of times on the farm, you do things a certain way just because it has always been done that way and it works. If it's not broke, don't fix it, right? The problem is in doing that, we're missing out on a lot of opportunities. We're actually ending up in a higher cost situation. You have lower yields, etc. So having this data accessible to producers in a way that they can see outside of research, outside of academia, is successful and will make them money. Ultimately, that is what drives them to make changes that are better for them, their farm, and the continuity of their land.
I believe there's a question over here. Go ahead.
I'm going to tell a quick story and then ask a question that's going to make me sound like a total Pollyanna. So bear with me. My quick story is back when people were sequencing the maize genome, there was a genome for popcorn that was sequenced in Mexico. And when they sequenced popcorn, they sequenced it and they didn't put the genome into an accessible database. They kept it and tried to figure out how they were going to share it because they were thinking about, we own this genome. And how do we get the most value out of it by keeping it and thinking about how we sell it, give it away, how do we get value out of it? And I remember visiting there, and part of our conversation that I finally put together this perspective that made a huge difference, and that was that unless you give it away, you don't own it. And what I meant by that was if you hold it to yourself and no one else uses it, there's no value and it doesn't grow and no one has access and it's as if you never generated it. And the only way really to give something away and still own it is to have that attribution. You think about companies that make donations to different places and they put their name on something. And so one of the things that I always sit with in these kinds of situations and I try to think about is a really simplified and direct and obvious way to think about the value of something is to say, how do I get direct monetary benefit out of giving you my data? That's what people easily, happily think, right? They think, I'm going to sell this. This is worth something. But then it turns out there's not an obvious, easy way to do that, and there aren't specifically people that want to purchase it, and you can't come up with ways to create policy that gives you that level, that direct benefit. And so my question, after telling that sort of Pollyanna, you don't own it unless you give it away, which sounds like something you'd see at the end of like a feel-good movie, right? How do we convey a concept like that in a way that people see that giving it away, holding on to the attribution, but giving it away is how they create the value? Is that a possibility? And the reason that this popped into my head earlier, Genevieve, you were talking about not just data sharing, but what people are going to get out of it, and that the question is, what value is this? How do I make a buck off this thing if I'm going to share it?
I think in terms of producers I've spoken to, and that's the only audience I can speak to, of course, I do think the sense, when I said, who's making a profit off of this, I don't necessarily think my producers are worried about making a profit off of their information personally. I think more so what their concern is that this data is going to be, extracted from one end of their operation to another, and then ultimately the information is going to be behind a paywall for other producers. In my experience only, and I can't speak to producers that either of you have spoken to, but it seems like they're more than willing to share their data. I have a board member who is he's an organic farmer, and so he's got a very different perspective from my other board members, and he very willingly shares his inputs, outputs, the technicalities, if you will, of his operation. He shares that all very willingly with other organic farmers. He's in a lot of forums and discussions, and he's more than willing to aid those other farmers in being successful. So I don't really think it's a matter of not wanting to share the information. It's more so a matter of sharing the information, to be quite blunt, with a giant corporation who's going to make everyone else pay for it. I think that's kind of the holdup with some of my producers. I do think that's a really good point, and that's a good way to look at it, though, is sharing it so that it does have inherent value. And I do think, in my experience, a lot of my producers are willing to do that.
I'll add on to that a little bit. And I guess I would say, as I got into the wheat industry, I was amazed at how sharing everybody is, especially if you look towards a breeding program. They share a lot of genetic material back and forth, especially in the early stages of breeding. For many years, they worked under just a code of conduct, wheat workers' code of conduct, that they would, share and be fair and honest and open with each other. And I think that's where you really make the strides, is sharing that information. Obviously, as that gets a little more mature, we get into intellectual property and things like that, and especially if there appears to be some kind of valuable trait or characteristic, then it becomes more of a value generating center for a person, a company, whatever. But certainly in the early stages, from what I've seen, there's a lot of openness and sharing, trying to find your way through all this enormous amount of information to maybe see where the path is and the value is.
I think an insightful question and point, and one that, philosophically I'm pretty well aligned with, the idea that, in the beef space, particularly at the seed stock sector, a long culture of data sharing. In fact, our systems are built where the person contributing the data also sends money with it. They send an investment to their organization to support, services and science and development and research and so forth. So they, when you register an animal or you're in some kind of fee-based system in a breed association, you're fiscally supporting that development work plus the data that goes along with it. And that's, I think, maybe a unique perspective amongst many trade groups that we have that sort of active engagement. And I don't think often our breeders recognize how significant that is in terms of building that infrastructure, building the genetic evaluation systems, and supporting that, because it's in their best interest, right? Collectively, they've recognized, and that's why they're a member of the breed association to start with, right? So there's this collective view of how do we, as a group of breeders, work to improve the germplasm of this specific population of animals. And there's this symbiotic relationship then that exists amongst and between breeders to figure out, how do we make the best XYZ, right? And there's no confusion at all about that we're also competitors, right? So they've aligned themselves along a set of trajectories and projects that mutually benefit themselves and still work competitively in the market space, right? And there's, the frustration I get once in a while is people make comments about, using the data against me, which is, I'm at core a capitalist, right? And so I'm thinking, well, you want to be anti-competitive, right? You don't want to compete with me. I'm going to use the science, I'm going to use the data to compete with you, and you don't want to compete. And that kind of frustrates the hell out of me, right? And I think when there's concerns about sharing the data, one of the things that we have to have is transparency in that, the source, the integrity, the willingness of people to compete fairly, right? I don't want unfair competition, I want fair competition, but a willingness to actually go and compete, right? So there's an underlying sort of philosophy of, at least in the breeding space, we all can't be equal, right? And we're all trying to figure out relatively where we sit, right? And where the opportunities to make improvement are. And I think that's true in the plant space as well. It's at a different scale and there's a different set of breeders competing, if you will, than in the beef space. But there's very much an underlying understanding of the symbiotic relationship that exists and the competitive relationship that exists. And I don't think we shouldn't mix those, right? We should figure out how do we build and that's one of the things I really like about this producer data cooperative idea is that it's producer driven, it's producer centric, but still supports, broader aims and objectives for, improvement, management, fiscal, whatever, right? But also protects the individual breeder or producer's ownership of that data. So they got to willingly give it, right? But they also recognize that there's fair play amongst the collaborators, okay?
I know we're butting up against our break, but perhaps just one more quick question for the panel.
Yeah. So thank you guys. I have more of a question and a comment. I'll start with the question, and then I'll lead into your answers with the comment that I would like you to comment on specifically. So I hope everyone in the room here is familiar with large language models. We're at a data conference, and so I think that is essential that we understand that space. I hope that you're also familiar with Google's quote-unquote leak that their large language model and OpenAI's large language model, ChatGPT-4, is not a moat. And the reason that I bring this up is because they're leaking this information in order to protect themselves from anti-monopoly and antitrust. They know that the model is not the important component. It's not what's going to make the money. The data is what makes it essential. They're arguing that open source large language models are actually more powerful than their model. That may or may not be true. The power of the model and how it's being leveraged is through the data that is collected. What I really appreciate about what you said, Bob, Mr. Weber, is that in the livestock industry that you're working in, there's a known cooperation, there's a cost of transaction that's beneficial to both parties or all the parties involved. You said you're a capitalist. I am 100% a socialist. And But what I think about that is that I think that in capitalism, we don't need to talk about trust. We need to talk about mechanisms so that people can be fairly and honestly dealt with and evaluated so that they don't need quote unquote trust in order to make transactions that benefit them. And then the final thing I wanted to ask is that I think there's actually a scale issue at the level of readiness of technologies, at what level of data you actually share. So I come from a heritage pioneer company. And if you guys are familiar with Raymond Baker, he was one of our first breeders. And when they were breeding hybrid corn, oftentimes breeders from DeKalb drove to Iowa and shared germplasm. It was before there was IP around genetics. But the point is that they were able to build a foundation of germplasm so that industries today can optimize for their specific markets. And while I don't believe that the state of that system is necessarily functioning as it should, it does allow for that innovation to occur. And so there are different stages at what we share level. Scale invariance for models and data, yes, ideal, extremely difficult to actually identify models and frameworks in order to implement them. And the cost is heavy. So I would like you to comment on whether or not you believe that scale at different readiness levels of technology do play a role in data sharing.
And certainly allow each panelist to tackle that, but maybe in the interest of time, quick thoughts.
I think scale is important, but if we look in the beef segment, there are lots of small, like 20 head, 50 head seed stock producers that are engaged in this process. And so we work across that range of technology adoption in the beef space, I think fairly effectively. Of course, it changes the amount of progress and improvement that any individual producer can make. But if you go look at the nucleus breeders, they are typically technology adopter, they're early adopters of technology cycle that really help make the genetic improvement, and the rest of it trickles down through multipliers. So there's lots of opportunity for folks to participate. And I think genomics is actually a big equalizer in that space as we find ways to discover, if you will, new genomic resource.
I guess I would have to agree with what you just mentioned on, we've got a wide scale of, large, small producers. We've got people growing different classes of wheat, different end use goals, different ways to engage in that. Your comment and question is good. It's pretty deep. I don't know that I've got a great answer for you or a comment for you, but it would be great for everybody to be able to maybe have a blind trust and go into some of these things. However, I guess in our world, a lot of business is done on trust and a relationship build and having some factors known. But I guess everybody, it's such a big industry, so many different methods, different ways, different ways to generate income or value. I guess it's just going to be interesting to see how this develops and expands and grows from here. But there's going to be a lot of different methods, a lot of different models probably. But I guess what I can say, it'll be an interesting ride.
And on that too, I mean, like I've mentioned earlier, there's a lot of different things going on in the sorghum industry. And what I see personally in Nebraska is a lot different from what the sorghum industry may be doing with data sharing in Texas, the largest sorghum producer. That space for them is going to look a lot different than it looks for us. There's not as much milo in Nebraska, and a lot of times it's in a pivot corner or in very small fields out in western Nebraska. I do think the scale is important, obviously, but there's so much variety and different uses and even just different varieties of sorghum within the industry. I'll just really to reiterate what Roy said. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see where it goes, but there is a space for everyone to participate in my industries anyway.
So I'd like to thank the audience for participation, our three panelists up here for their time and expertise. And one thing I drew out of this that perhaps I had not fully appreciated before was you all three represent what we call commodities right now. And part of this discussion needs to contemplate the changing of a commodity mindset and the opportunity, and for some people, the threat of paying value for value now. And also the differentiation between data and information as we think about the value proposition, because those aren't necessarily the same thing. But if you would, join me in thanking our three panelists.